Welcome to all of you. In today's lecture, today we discuss about the macros and macro preprocessor. Today we consider the introductory part of this chapter. This is the fourth chapter in our course. Now, in this case, we discuss how we require the macros or how we can design the macro preprocessor. There are two parts will be discussed in this particular chapter. First of all, we consider the macros. What is the macros? How we can define the macros? How macro expansion will be takes place? And what is the purpose of macros? Okay. Now, after that, we consider how we design the macros. We design that particular macros. In that case, that is, we need to pre-process some macros, and how we can process that particular macros accordingly. We need some algorithms, we need some data structures corresponding to that macro pre-processor. We design such a data structures like assemblers. In assembler, we discuss the use of assembler, how we can implement or how we can define or structure that particular assembler. We consider there are two types of assembler, that is single pass assembler and multi-pass assembler, that is the two pass assembler, and accordingly the data structure will be considered under that particular assembler. Similarly, here we can consider the macro preprocessor. Our main task is to design the macro preprocessor. But before designing to that of the macro preprocessor, we need to consider the macros. What is the macros and its corresponding implementation in our system programming? Okay. Now, first of all, we consider that macros. What is the macro? Now, in this case, here we consider macros are used to provide the program generation facility through a macro expansion. Okay. Macro in short, we consider the macro is nothing but the small piece of a code that is like our functions. Okay, but there are some differences between the macros and the functions. Here we consider that macros, that is, they are used to provide the program generation facility through the macro expansion. Now, many languages provides the built-in facilities for writing a macros like PLI or C, ADA or C++. All these languages can use or can provide the facility to write our program in that particular macros. Now, in case of our C language, we consider the hash include. Now, hash include, it is one of the macro. Okay. Now, hash preceded words or hash preceded strings are considered as a macros in that particular C language. That is, we can use a C. In case of the C programming language, we consider the hash include. It is the one of the macro which includes our header file into that particular program. Then we consider the hash define, which defines the symbolic constants into that particular program. These are nothing but the macros. They have specific definition, and when we consider that particular macros, we consider that particular definitions of that macro, they are already defined at the library side or in the library files. Okay. Now, when we define a symbolic constant, actually we define that particular macro, where we call that particular macro, that is, macro has a specific name where we can use in our program. Okay. And that macro will be replaced with the help of a particular statements of that macro defined in the given definition. Here we will see some examples of that hash defined macro, that is to define some functions. Okay, we write the definition of square of a of a particular number. We define the particular macro for that square. Okay, the square name of that macro will be called at the position where we require that particular implementation. We use that particular implementation, or we can use that square name of that macro in that location where we require that particular square of the given number. The corresponding definition will be replaced at the time or before the compilation. Okay, that's why we require the macro preprocessor, that is to pre-process before the compilation. We need to process that macros, that is, we consider preprocessor before compilation. Okay, here when macro will be expanded, macro expansion can take place with the help of preprocessor, and that preprocessor can replace macro name with corresponding definition of that particular macros. Okay, here assembly language also provides such facility. In case of the assembly language, we can write the macros. Okay, we write some statements under that particular macro in assembly language also. Now, when a language does not support built-in facility for writing a macros, what is to be done? Then what is the solution for that particular problem? Some languages were provide the macro facility, some were not provided to that, or somewhere not provide such a facility to write the macros. Now here the programmer may achieve an equivalent effect by using the generalized preprocessor or software tools like AWK of a Unix. AWK or AWK in the Unix operating system. Here Unix operating system does not support some macro definitions. Okay, for that purpose we can use that some generalized preprocessor softwares or we consider the software tools to process that or to write that particular macros by the programmer. Okay, that is the requirement of that particular macro. Now here we define in simple words, we define the macros. That is the definition of that macro can says a macro is a unit of specification of a program generation through a expansion. Now we explore this particular definition, that is we have a particular code. We consider one example. We have a particular code having 4 lines or 5 lines into that particular code. Suppose we want to increment the number. Okay, we want to increment number. For that purpose we consider that is group of 4 statements, and in that group of 4 statements we can have coding or we can have statements which increments the specific number with 1. Okay, of each execution of that particular 4 statement, our number will be incremented by value 1. We consider these statements in our program at 5 different location. That is the 4 line numbers. Okay, four number of lines, and that 4 lines are used in our program at 5 different location. That means total 4 into 5. How many? That is 4 into 5, that is 20 lines will be increased in your program when we use direct writing or we use our regular programming facility or our programming situation. Here we need to write 20 lines, that is 4 lines are repeated more than once in your program. Okay, now we replace that 4 lines repetition with a macro. That means we write that 4 lines at once at the start of our program, and we rename that 4 lines with a specific name. That name is nothing but the macro name. That is, this is a small piece of code which is repeated more than once in our program. We define that repeated code at once in our code or once in our program and rename that particular 4 lines. Okay, now that is the name of the macro, and this macro name will be called where we require that 4 lines. Okay, there is no need to write all 4 lines at this particular location. We need to define, we need to write the only name of that 4 lines. Okay, this is the group of 4 lines, and that group will be identified with the help of that name. That is nothing but the macro name. And when we are preprocessor, we start preprocessing that particular program where we use the macro name. Okay, where we use the macro name, our macros for statements are replaced with that particular macro name. ओके, जसं आपण फंक्शन कन्सिडर करतो, फंक्शन जिथे जिथे आपल्याला फंक्शनची गरज पडते तिथे तिथे आपण त्या फंक्शनला कॉल देतो. नाउ हियर इट इज ऑल्सो सेम सिच्युएशन कॅन बी गिवन हियर, बट preprocessor can replace all 4 lines of that macro at the macro call. इथे सुद्धा मॅक्रोला कॉलच द्यायचा आहे, परंतु तो कॉल जो दिला जाईल तो कॉल काय केला जातो प्रेप्रोसेसर कडनं त्या स्टेटमेंटने रिप्लेस केला जातो. दॅट इज नथिंग बट द मॅक्रो एक्सपान्शन. वी कॅन हॅव डिफरंट टाइप्स ऑफ मॅक्रो एक्सपान्शन, कॅन बी एक्सप्लेन इन द नेक्स्ट पॉइंट. ओके, बट बिफोर देयर वी कन्सिडर दिस पर्टिक्युलर डेफिनेशन व्हॉट इज एक्झॅक्ट द मॅक्रो. जे ज्या लाईन्स आपल्याला त्या ठिकाणी रिपीट होत होत्या, आता त्या लाईन्स रिपीट करण्याची गरज नाही. त्या लाईन्स आपण 4 लाईन एकाच ठिकाणी लिहिणार आणि त्या 4 लाईनला एका नावाने मेन्शन करणार. जसं आपण फंक्शन लिहितो आणि त्या फंक्शनला एक नेम देतो, आणि जिथे जिथे त्या फंक्शनची गरज पडते तिथे ते आपण त्या फंक्शनचे सगळे स्टेटमेंट लिहित नाही. आपण काय करतो, फक्त त्या फंक्शनचं नाव देतो. सेम टास्क विल बी हँडल विथ हेल्प ऑफ दिस पर्टिक्युलर मॅक्रो. ओके, दॅट इज नथिंग बट द मॅक्रोज, अँड these macros we consider this is the unit of a specification of program जनरेशन थ्रू अ पर्टिक्युलर एक्सपान्शन. म्हणजे आता प्रोग्रामचं युनिट आपण एका ठिकाणी लिहिला, परंतु ज्यावेळेस तो प्रोग्राम प्रीप्रोसेस होतो त्यावेळेस त्याला काय केलं जातं, एक्सपांड केलं जातं आणि तुमचा प्रोग्राम जो आहे सोर्स प्रोग्राम, तो फुल सोर्स प्रोग्राम त्या ठिकाणी काय केलं जातो, राईट केलं जातो. सपोज तुमच्याकडे 10 लाईनचा कोड आहे आणि त्या 10 लाईनच्या कोड मध्ये तुम्ही 4 ठिकाणी काय केलंय किंवा 5 ठिकाणी तुम्ही काय केलं, तुमचं मॅक्रो कॉल केलेला आहे आणि त्या मॅक्रो मध्ये तुमच्या 4 लाईन्स आहेत. ओके, मग ज्या वेळेस तो प्रोसेसर कडनं तो प्रोग्राम प्रोसेस होतोय, तुमच्या एक्झिस्टिंग ज्या 10 लाईन्सचा प्रोग्राम असेल, तो आता किती लाईन्सचा होणार आहे, प्रोसेसर कडनं प्रोग्राम हँडल झाल्यानंतर किंवा तुमचा सोर्स प्रोग्राम प्रोसेसर कडनं प्रोसेस झाल्यानंतर मॅक्रो नेमच्या जागी तुमच्या त्या 4 लाईन्स काय केल्या जातील, पुट केल्या जातील. म्हणजे 20 लाईन्स काय झाल्या तुमच्या आता मेन प्रोग्राम मध्ये आल्या आणि तुमच्या एक्झिस्टिंग 10 लाईन ज्या होत्या त्या 10 लाईन आल्या. म्हणजे अशा टोटल 30 लाईन्स काय केल्या जातील तुमच्या प्रोग्राम मध्ये त्या ठिकाणी आता आफ्टर प्री प्रोसेसिंग त्या ठिकाणी दिल्या जातील. ओके, नाउ हिअर मॅक्रो कॅन कन्सिस्ट ऑफ अ नेम, that is the name of the macro which identify that particular unit of a code, then set of formal parameters. Here function requires the parameter. Now same way we require, or that particular macro requires some parameters, we can pass the value to that particular macros. We consider different types of parameter or types of the parameter for that macro. Okay, now here we consider the set of some formal parameters and the body of a code. Body of a code means what, that is those statements which are repeated in your program, we consider that common statements into the body of that macro. Okay, these are nothing but the component of macros. Next thing is nothing but the use of macro name with a set of actual parameter is replaced by some code generated from its body. This is called as the macro expansion. Now here we call the macros, and at the time of macro calling we can pass some parameters, that is we call that parameter as an actual parameter, like our function. When our function is called, or when we pass the parameter to the function at the time of function call, that is the actual parameter, and that actual parameter are catch into the definition of a function. That definition of function contains the formal parameter. Like same way in case of the macros, where we define the macro, we pass some formal parameter to that definition, and when we actually call the macro, at that time we need to pass the actual parameter to that of the macro. Where function call is identified, our actual parameters are replaced by some code. Replaced by some code means what, that is that actual parameter program or that macro call is replaced with the help of or definition of that macro. That is nothing but the macro expansion. This process is nothing but the macro expansion. जिथे macro call होतोय तिथे मॅक्रोचे अंडर बॉडीचे जे स्टेटमेंट्स असतील, मॅक्रो मध्ये जे काही नंबर ऑफ स्टेटमेंट्स तुम्ही लिहिलेले असतील, ते स्टेटमेंट काय केले जातात, मॅक्रो कॉलच्या ठिकाणी रिप्लेस केले जातात. म्हणजे मॅक्रो कॉलचं एकच स्टेटमेंट आहे आणि मॅक्रो बॉडी मध्ये 4 स्टेटमेंट आहेत. ओके, मॅक्रो कॉल दॅट सिंगल स्टेटमेंट रिप्लेस विथ दॅट 4 statements. Okay, in this way we can consider that particular representation or the macro expansion. Okay, now 2 kinds of expansion can be identified. Which 2 types of expansion can be considered, that is we consider that 2 types of expansion, that is we consider the macro expansion under lexical expansion, and second one is nothing but the semantic expansion. We consider that 2 types in details in next point. Now lexical expansion, in the sense we can consider according to the syntax, and semantic expansion, that is according to the meaning of that statement, that a macro will be expanded. Okay, now we consider both type in details in next point. Now next thing is nothing but why to use macros, that is the use of that macro. Here we consider programmer needs frequently some instructions. Now which instructions, suppose here we consider one example, move RA register CNT. CNT is nothing but the one symbol, that is the count. Okay, add a register equal to 1, this is the constant value which is nothing but the literal, and it is added into the a register value. And then move a register CNT, we can move that result which is incremented by 1 into the CNT variable. Okay, we consider this particular statement, this is the repeated code which is given in your program. तुम्हाला जेव्हा असेंब्ली प्रोग्राम तुम्ही राईट करणार आहात, हा कोड तुम्हाला बऱ्याच ठिकाणी रिपीट करावा लागतोय. ओके, नाउ दिस इज नथिंग बट द प्रोग्रामर नीड, that is to repeat these 3 statements more than once in your program. Now we write this particular code more than once in your program. Now it is a tedious task to write such a code each time, Now another way is to write the subroutine for this particular and call when we require. Subroutine means what? We can consider the function. We write the function for this particular program. Okay, but in that subroutine, what happened? That is, you know very well what is the how function call will be executed. That is, each time control will transfer to that function body, execute the function. When completion of the function execution, and control again return to that of the main function where from where it is called. Okay, that is nothing but transferring the control from main function to the function body. After completing execution of function body, again it come back to the main function. This is nothing but the transferring of a control. Now it requires some time, it wastes some time to transferring such controls between main function to the subroutine. Okay, now in this case here we can consider execution time is required for this particular process for the small group of the statement. Now we have to execute only 3 statements, and every time we need to transfer the control. The time required to execute these 3 statements is less, but transferring the control from main function to that subroutine, it is the maximum. That's why our program execution time will be increased. Now we can define the macro instead of the subroutine. सबरुटीनच्या ऐवजी काय करणार आता या ठिकाणी आपण जर मॅक्रोचे डेफिनेशन जर दिल्या, we can define that particular macro for these particular statements. Whenever macro name is appear in the program, it is replaced by the above instruction statement. Okay, programmer does not need to write that particular statement more than once. We only write the name of that particular macro. Okay, we require only to write the name of this macro where we require these particular statements. जसं तुम्ही फंक्शन कॉल करता, फंक्शन कॉलचं नाव तुम्ही त्या ठिकाणी देता, फंक्शनचं नाव त्या ठिकाणी तुम्ही देता, तसं मॅक्रोचं नाव फक्त जिथे जिथे गरज आहे तिथे तिथे तुम्हाला काय करायचं, त्या मॅक्रोचं नाव मेन्शन करायचं. मग इथे काय झालं, कंट्रोल प्रत्येक वेळेस त्या ठिकाणी त्या फंक्शन कडे किंवा त्या सबरूटीन कडे पास करण्याची गरज नाही. ज्या वेळेस प्रे प्रोसेसर कडनं हे तुमचा प्रोग्राम प्रे प्रोसेस केला जाणार आहे, त्यावेळेस ऑटोमॅटिकली ज्या ज्या लोकेशनला त्या मॅक्रोचं नेम आयडेंटिफाय झालं, त्या त्या लोकेशनला हे 3 स्टेटमेंट काय केले जातील, रिप्लेस केले जातील. Now there is no need to transfer the control at every time, because all these 3 statements are available at the same position, and control will be continue to execution for that particular program. Okay, त्याचा एक्झिक्युशन जो सिक्वेन्स असेल त्या कंट्रोलला त्या ठिकाणी चेंज करण्याची गरज पडणार नाही. तिथे हे स्टेटमेंट आलेलं असतील तो सिक्वेन्शियली हे स्टेटमेंट पुढे कंटिन्यू करत जाईल. प्रोग्रामर डज नॉट नीड टू राईट दिस स्टेटमेंट. these statements are expanded or written by that macro preprocessor. Okay, फक्त काय करायचंय, मॅक्रो डिफाईन करण्याचं काम फक्त प्रोग्रामरला करायचंय. त्याला एक्सपांड करण्याचं काम जे आहे ते ऑटोमॅटिकली प्रेप्रोसेसर कडनं केलं जाणार आहे. म्हणून तिथे काय झालं, तो जो टाइम असेल तो टाइम त्या ठिकाणी रिड्यूस झाला. प्रोग्राम एक्झिक्युशनचा टाइम सुद्धा काय होणार, त्या ठिकाणी रिड्यूस केला जाईल. दॅट इज नथिंग बट द मॅक्रो need, that is we require the macros. Okay, now in this way we can consider the use of that macro, or how we can consider that particular macro. Now in this case we can consider some differences between the macros and subroutines. How macros are differ from the subroutine. There are some similarities and some differences between that macros and subroutines. We can consider some similarities between the macros. Both allow reuse of the code segment. This is the similarity. Macro can also use reuse the code. Subroutine can be used to reuse the particular code. दोन्ही ठिकाणी आपण प्रोग्रामचं किंवा त्या पर्टिक्युलर ग्रुप ऑफ स्टेटमेंटला रियूज करतोय. दिस इज द कॉमन थिंग in between macros and subroutine, that is the function. The second thing is nothing but both makes program easier to read and allow changes to be made at one place. दोन्ही ठिकाणी एकाच लोकेशनला, दोन्ही मॅक्रो मध्ये पण आणि सबरूटीन मध्ये पण तुम्हाला चेंजेस काय करायचे, एका पर्टिक्युलर लोकेशनला त्या ठिकाणी चेंजेस करण्यासाठी ते अलाउ केले जातील. नाउ बोथ हॅव अ प्रोटोटाइप which contains parameter followed by group of statements frequently needed. जे स्टेटमेंट्स परत परत रिक्वायर्ड आहेत, पुन्हा पुन्हा गरजेचे आहेत, ते आपल्याला मॅक्रो मध्ये पण बघायला मिळतात आणि फंक्शन मध्ये पण बघायला मिळतात. ओके, these are some similarities. Now we can consider some differences between them. What are the differences? That is, first of all, we consider the factor effectiveness. Which one is more effective in our programming session? That is, when we consider the factors, in case of the effectiveness factor, that is macro useful for small group of the statement. That is here, this is the most important part in that particular macro and function. Okay, when we consider the macro, we have a small set of program statements. Then we can consider the macros, but we have very large set of the statements. Then for that purpose macro are not preferred. we can consider the subroutine. That is, for a small group of statement, we can consider the macros, and subroutines are effectively implemented for large group of statements. Now, second one is nothing but the code space requirement. Code space requirement consists, that is the size of source program is increased after macro expansion. तुमचा source program ची size वाढते macro expand जेव्हा होतील त्यावेळेस. But in case of the subroutine, that is subroutine is stored at fixed particular location. Okay. Then size of the program remains as it is. There is no incrementation of size of your source program. But statement in the subroutine appear only once. Okay. In case of a subroutine, we write the program at once. Only control will transfer from one location to the another location. This is one thing can be considered, or this one small procedure can be involved in case of the subroutines. Now, execution speed require less time for the macros, and execution speed for subroutine requires larger time because transferring the control from one location to the another location. Next difference can be considered, that is processing required by the assembler. Okay, why? Because there is a preprocessor requirement. For that preprocessor, we write the program in case of the assembly language, and in case of the assembly language, we process the assembly language with the help of assembler. Then in case of the subroutine, it does not require any preprocessing. Okay, preprocessing ची गरज त्या ठिकाणी नसणार आहे. Now, suitability of environment, suitable in time critical dynamic programming environment in case of the macros. Okay, and in case of the subroutine, that is suitable in static environment, that is where we consider the fixed location. At that time, we can consider the static allocations, we consider that particular subroutines. Now, we summarize all these things of macros and assemblers into this particular figure. Now, you can see this source program with macro. Okay, this is the macro definition, which contains that particular source program contains the macro definition given to the macro preprocessor first. Macro preprocessor expand our program, source program will be expanded, macros will be expanded, and these without macro source program will be generated after macro preprocessor. Okay, the source program without macro, which is given to the assembler, because this program is in the form of assembly language. Okay, this program is given in the form of assembly statement, and this assembly statement are need to process. For that purpose, we can consider the assembler. Okay, we will discuss these things in the previous chapter. We consider this assembler to process that particular source program without macro, and it generate, that assembler can generate the target code. This part will be discussed in the previous chapter also. आपण हा असेंबलर टू टार्गेट कोडचा जो प्रोसेसिंग पार्ट आहे तो मागच्या चॅप्टर मध्ये असेंबलर मध्ये बघितलाय, त्याचं प्रोसेसिंग कसं केलं जातं. नाउ वी कन्सिडर दिस पार्ट नाउ, that is source program with macro given to the macro preprocessor, and how macro preprocessor can convert the given source program without macro. We need to consider this particular part into this given chapter. Okay, आपल्याला हा इथला जो पार्ट आहे हा पार्ट या ठिकाणी काय करायचं आहे आता डिस्कस करायचं. नाउ वी कन्सिडर this preprocessing of the macros and how we can define, we consider some examples for that particular macros, and how that example can be pre-processed using preprocessor. We consider all these things into the next lecture. Now today we can over this particular point here, that is introductory part of that macros. Okay, now